to this webinar on information campaigns. My name is Laila Hajabdou, and I'm a part-time assistant professor at the Migration Policy Center, and I'm really delighted to have this webinar and to guide you through it with 3 excellent speakers on a very topical theme. Also, in order to frame the debate, I also prepared some little slides. I hope you can see them. So the webinar has the very provocative, but I think very spot-on title, Informing to Dissuade. So I just wanted to start also with my observation in my own research that when I interviewed migration governance actors across Europe, one thing that became really crystal clear is that governance actors understand migration policy more and more as a form of communication policy. So the aspect how we communicate about migration is seen as being decisive in steering and managing migration. So we'll hear much more from our 3 experts and also about the US, but I took a picture. So the quote, migration policies, communication policy, is actually from an interior minister of a key migration state in the European Union. And the picture you see below is actually from North America, from the United States under the Obama presidency at the time. So to highlight that this is really a transatlantic phenomenon. And that's why also really further emphasizes the relevance of the webinar we have today. And also wanted to read to you a short extract of an interview I did within the European Commission. And I didn't do research particularly on information campaigns, but it was really an aspect that came through repeatedly and repeated like often. So I want just to quote some lines from it. So my interview partner said, we really need to go into the country of origin where they live and depart to convince people, don't take the risk. And then I jump. He says then, so we really need to be more targeted. The fact that you risk dying at sea is not a major factor for them because they say, because they know it now, it's all over the media. They know it, and sometimes they say, we have 1 chance in 20 to die at sea. We'll take the risk, and I'll take my chance. But if it is explaining, first of all, you might die. Secondly, you might end up in detention in Libya in awful conditions. If you are a girl, you might be raped, and so on and so forth. But on top of it, when you arrive in Europe, it's not going to be paradise because you already have 1 million guys who have just arrived and are searching for jobs. You're not going to find a job. You're going to be in tough conditions. Don't do it. Then it has a better impact. So just to frame the debate and also to come back to the provocative title already, to give already a partial answer, if it's about dissuasion. But I won't take much longer because we have 3 excellent experts who will go much more in depth than I could and give us an overview about the very topical and recent research. So the first one will be Verena Katharina Brendle, who is currently a visiting fellow at the UI and also based at the University of Vienna. And I just want to highlight that Verena manages to truly overcome disciplinary boundaries with her work. And she works a lot on the politics of contention and solidarity with a strong focus on communication and media. So one aspect we as political scientists sometimes are not so skilled in, but she really combines these communication studies also with a very much political sociology, political science perspective. And I wanted to highlight this new book that just came out and where I know that Verena, along with her colleague Olga Eiseli, has been one of the souls of this book, and I heartily recommend this book. It's also open access. So first one will be Verena, and then we'll go on to have Professor Williams from the University of Arizona, who was also working intensively on the issue. And I just here put you out an article, a recent article of her exactly on the issue if you want to dig deeper also after the presentations. And I want to highlight, and I think that's really important because gender is still very much ignored issue in migration research. And I think this is really important that Gill's work confronts what Hondagneo and Sotelo called in 2013, but is still accurate today, the persistent blindness to feminist issues and gender in migration research. So we are particularly grateful to have Gill with us here to present also this important dimension of migration, contention, and politics of communication and information. And last but not least, also Antoine Picou, who, like the others, really doesn't need an introduction. So I think each of us who has been studying migration will have come across his important and seminal work. If you haven't done so, it's really time to do so, or to reread his important work. I think most of us, as I said, will know, but I just wanted to highlight again 2 of his last books, the International Organization for Migration, co-edited with his colleague Martin Geiger, and also the work that really has changed the perspective of how we look at processes of politicization and at international organization, the book on depoliticizing migration, and how really international organizations and the framing of win-win-win for everyone can be really questioned. And this is what Antoine, of course, does with lots of his work. So we're very pleased that he also now tackles the issue of information campaigns. And I'm very pleased and looking forward to hear all the 3 of you. So I will stop now and with further ado, hand over to my colleague, Verena.
Thank you, Laila, for this wonderful introduction and informative, which I think is a perfect springboard for starting right into this talk. I will, as my title suggests, talk about information campaigns for potential migrants from a perspective of government communication. Before that, I want to briefly give an introduction in terms of what exactly we are focusing on in this seminar. The focus on information campaigns comes from an increased efforts by EU governments, EU member states to initiate campaigns for migrants, for potential migrants in origin countries or in transit countries. And 104 campaigns by EU member states have been implemented, plus a few more by EU institutions. And these are numbers from 2019, actually, by the European Migration Network. So it's possible that there have been more. Actually, for a fact, I know that there have been more now since 2019. And as I said, I focus more on the European context, and we will extend that as we continue in this webinar. The focus is also on the involvement of governments. So we talk about campaigns where governments are either implementing and authoring or funding campaigns and outsourcing basically the content work to other organizations such as the International Organization for Migration. The declared goals of these campaigns are to inform, to empower, to warn potential migrants about the dangers of irregular pathways and to support them to make informed decisions. So that being said, these campaigns are explicitly directed at people before their arrival. And my focus here is on information campaigns through governmental perspective. And this is a project funded by the Independent Research Fund Denmark, and it's called Informing to Dissuade. So these campaigns, as Laila already in her introduction mentioned, I started with a provocative title because they have received considerable criticism, and I would say that this criticism can be divided in 2 different categories. On the one hand, there is criticism about the question of effectiveness and the impact of these campaigns. So on the one hand, there's a considerable lack of systematic evaluations of these campaigns. So it is difficult to actually, that might be methodological problems, very difficult to conduct experiments with people who are on the move, in fact. But otherwise there's a lack of systematic evaluations because because it might be costly and because this is only just starting. When we look at campaigns via social media or websites, there has been, the European Commission has commissioned a evaluation on certain campaigns, and there it says that media are only effective to reach out to an audience. However, it might be difficult to actually change behavior, dissuade people to actually take irregular pathways. So that is one aspect of the criticism that these campaigns have received. What we, however, want to do in this webinar, I think, is that we want to go beyond these questions, the question of effectiveness. We want to ask not, do these campaigns actually work, but what is their role within migration governments? Are they ethical? What is the morality behind it? And there's a considerable amount of research slowly developing that these campaigns have been called symbolic, providing governments with the option of having a humanitarian image, although irregular migration policy, especially in the EU, has become a little bit more strict. They're effective, so they're more highly emotionalized messages, and they're discouraging to people who do not have access to regular pathways. That being said, there might also be a measure to indirectly externalize border controls and migration by trying to reach people before they're actually on their way, from the research side. And then also in the public and political debate, these campaigns have received criticism. There's been a considerable amount of freedom of information requests from actors. There was a case in the UK last year where a specific website has received criticism for not declaring which governmental branches behind it, has received critical news coverage. If we think about the placement of advertisement in Lebanese newspapers by the Danish government in 2015. So this is all something that is criticized in terms of appropriateness. I will look at, I'm trying to understand this argument, this criticism, trying to understand the ambiguity of these campaigns in a way. I'm looking at government communication. So in liberal democracies, there are certain standards, normative standards and ethical principles that government communication is supposed to follow. Some of them are to be neutral, informative, and non-partisan or non-political, in the sense of that they should be free from interference of party politics. So what I'm talking about here is government communication, not during an election, not before an election campaign, not by political party actors, but by executive organs. And this has a function. These normative standards are there to promote public engagement, because only government communication that serves the public good can promote public engagement. And in this way, also the public can hold government accountable. So the problem, or the question that I'm asking is then, what does this mean for governmental information campaigns? And that is part of a forthcoming paper of mine, where I'm wondering, or where I'm asking actually, how are these information presented? What are the communicative strategies? And from a more normative perspective, how can we deal with the standards of government communication in terms of these campaigns? So the methodology is qualitative. I look at 2 campaign websites, Aware Migrants that is mainly authored by the IOM, but also initiated by the Ministry of Interior in Italy, and Rumors About Germany by the Federal Foreign Office. So there are different organizational structures behind these campaigns. Both have been praised for their transparency. Both have a broad portfolio of social media and website presence, and both publicly declare that their aim is to inform and empower migrants and not to deter. I've screened these websites. The sample is based on an April 2020 sample. That being said, these websites, they are also updated and continuously analyzed. But the last time I checked, not that much has changed. So this is still very current. And as I said, this research is exploratory, qualitative, and interpretative, because I also want to look at how these campaigns basically, what are the strategies, how can we compare, what are the differences, and for that I look at the reference external sources. That means I have looked at links and URLs that these campaign websites contain, where they, for example, reference to, as in go to that and that newspaper, go to that and that website, to kind of understand where information comes from, where they relate, where they what kind of information they reference. And then I wanted to know about the latent meanings and themes. And therefore I look at the posts or the articles on these campaign websites that are basically internally on these websites to understand better what and how, what is being said and how it is presented and maybe framed. If we go to the external sources, I brought this, this graph, and we see it already that there's a different setup between Rumors About Germany and Aware Migrants. This might be not so much surprising, given that Rumors About Germany is a governmental campaign in the sense that it is implemented and authored by the Foreign Ministry in Germany. So as you can see, there's the majority of the sources, the links, relates to other migration, to other governmental institutions. This could be a website that is done by a governmental institutions such as Deutschland.de, where newcomers can get information. It's also related to other ministries and other agencies. This campaign also refers to international supranational organizations, the IOM, and also the EU and other ministries. Aware Migrants has a different setup, and what I find quite interesting here is that especially the media part of these URLs is very high. That means this campaign uses a lot of external news. So from BBC World, so that can be public service broadcasters, international broadcasters such as Deutsche Welle, BBC News, but also The Guardian and other newspapers. There's no real geographical focus. There are French media, there are French-speaking media, there is, for example, the Nigerian Guardian in there. So it's difficult to actually say there's one geographical focus, but the main difference here is really the different types of sources. And this together will also explain the campaign-specific themes that come up. So focusing specifically on the differences of these campaigns, because all of them have a few information on regular pathways. All of them refer to certain procedures, but the real differences of these campaigns we see in the different focal points. Aware Migrants is focused on the dangers on irregular pathways. And that being said, I should add that Aware Migrants also has a strong focus on videos and YouTube videos, where returnees, potential migrants, other migrants share their experiences about irregular migration. These are highly emotionalized. I have not included them in this research because I'm focusing on text-based issues only. And there's other research that has actually looked at the YouTube videos, but the focus here really is on dangers on irregular pathways. The news are often about strict immigration policies in the EU, in European countries. There's a focus on migration by boat on the Mediterranean, so there's also geographical focus. And there's a focus on people coming from or being stuck in Libya, for example. Rumors About Germany has a different strategy. It promotes return programs, voluntary return programs. So there are information about how to get access to voluntary return programs, what they actually do. Then it has a focus on legal procedures, on myth busting. So it's more reactive towards myths or rumors that come up amongst migrants potentially. The website is also built like that. For example, there could be questions about does the German government pay, or will there be someone saving you by boat, and so on and so forth. So in this way, the migration of people can get information, especially also on legal procedures, for example, family reunification, and much of this is framed in a way that says it is not as good as you think. So this is really a focus on myth busting, on trying to be, in a way, this is dissuasion in terms of don't get your hopes up high. The geographical focus is different than with Aware Migrants is a focus on Germany. So what we see if we and on the legal implications of Germany. And what we see if we compare these two campaigns in that sense, then is that, of course, they are reiterating these dominant migration management narratives from their own national experiences. This is, on the one hand, not particularly surprising, given that we have two different governments behind these campaigns. But since the refugee crisis or the migration crisis from 2015 or 14 onwards, we see that Italy was way more a first arrival country where people crossed through via the Mediterranean. And Germany was publicly more discussed as a destination country where people would want to go. So we see these national experiences reflected. We also see that these messages oscillate between humanitarianism and securitization. So saying, please protect yourself because there are these and those controls, these are the rights, so you won't have a chance. So this shifts the responsibility to migrants themselves to see, should they go or should they not go? And then on the sidelines, the regular channel is not particularly, or the information regular channels are not particularly helpful for people who are already on irregular pathways and are not likely to return or then turn around and go home. So in conclusion, coming back to the theme of government communication and the standards of government communication, how can we make sure that government communication is neutral if, for example, the policies are not particularly neutral? So there's an ambiguity and an ambivalence that this raises. And the other question is, and how far are dominant migration policy narratives helpful for migrants on their way? They're certainly not, in that sense, they are dissuasive. There's no way around that. In that sense, we can't speak of anything else than dissuasion. But on the other hand, these questions about the intentionality, about the ethics, and about accountability about these campaigns. So who checks the institution that communicates? These questions are important signposts because they reflect on, because that they allow us to reflect on what we actually say to migrants. How can we hold governments or other institutions accountable for what they say on such a contested issue such as immigration policies and migration politics? And by this, I stop and I hand over.
Thanks so much, Verena. Yeah, I would like to invite Jill to take the floor.
I just share screen real quick. Okay. Hello, everyone. Thank you so much for having me here today. I'm really excited to be here, and I'm going to present some findings from a research project that I'm conducting in collaboration with Kate Coddington, who is an assistant professor at the University at Albany in the SUNY system in New York State in the United States. The findings that I'm going to present are part of a larger project or a larger paper that's forthcoming in the International Feminist Journal of Politics. And I'm happy to share that with anyone who's interested. So in this paper, we contribute to feminist analyses of the role of the family and familial ideologies, the role that those play in shaping immigration and border enforcement policies, as well as their impact on migrants and refugees, by exploring the way the family is mobilized within these public information campaigns that are aimed at dissuading unauthorized migration. In doing so, we also contribute to work in the field of affective governmentality. So work in the last few years that's really pointed to the important role that emotions and affect play in shaping the conduct of populations and how governments really pull on emotion and affect to shape what people do. So as a form of governance. So this paper is based on research we're conducting as part of a large comparative study looking at public information campaigns carried out by the US and Australia between 1990 and about 2018. This project is funded by the US National Science Foundation. We're using mixed qualitative methods, including archival research, freedom of information requests to both national governments, interviews, and media and policy analysis to really understand the development and implementation of PICs and how they alter the geographies of border enforcement and state sovereignty. To date, we've collected over 1,000 different documents across the two national contexts are really files. And these files include campaign materials. Some of those are print, but there are also a lot of audio and video files, governmental documents related to PICs, media articles, and evaluations and other reports that were produced by the contractors hired to produce campaigns. So one of the things that I'm not really going to go into today, but just to mention, is that these campaigns are generally produced by public relations firms that are contracted out by the governments. And we're also conducting key informant interviews with a lot of the people involved in developing the campaigns. For data analysis, the materials have been uploaded to Atlas TI, a qualitative data analysis software, and thematically coded. In particular, for this paper, we coded and analyzed the materials in order to trace the way in which the family was mobilized in campaign materials, the emotions and affects being circulated, and the targets of campaign messages. So were they targeting migrants themselves, unaccompanied minors, parents, so on and so forth. So we narrowed the total data set to examine those campaigns where the family figured pretty centrally. And so that resulted in a data set of 3 campaigns from the United States. And those campaigns were developed between 2004 and 2017. And 10 campaigns from the Australian case produced between roughly 2009 and 2018. We then analyzed the data in order to identify shifts over time, commonalities and differences across the 2 geographic sites. Campaign messages and shifts were then analyzed in relation to larger geopolitical and geoeconomic context in order to gain further insight into the purpose and goals of the campaigns and why certain shifts happened when they did. So today, I'm going to move into empirics in just a minute, and I'm going to focus pretty much solely on the US case because that's the case that I am leading and I'm most familiar with. But before I do so, I want to point out some general findings across the whole project. So in both cases, we show how emotion and affect are used to tether migrants to place, hindering mobility, while also obscuring the role political, economic, and social policies play in creating the conditions for migration. And this is really done via the circulation of campaign materials that redistribute responsibility for migration-related harms away from the state and onto individual migrants, and then that expand responsibility to include not just the potential migrant themselves, but also the wider family and community in which they're embedded. So those folks as culpable alongside migrants. The main difference between the 2 sites is that in the Australian case, there's a significant focus on shame, especially shame associated with financial loss is mobilized a lot in these campaigns. Whereas in the US context, there's a focus really around grief and loss. So now I'm going to move into empirics from the US side. So in the US context, the family first entered into PICs in the early 2000s. And this was in the first large-scale PIC that was called the No Mas Cruces campaign. This campaign ran from about 2004 to 2012. And the family was rather marginal in the campaign overall, with most of the materials focusing specifically on sort of the seemingly detached male migrant. However, when the family enters into campaign messages, it's in a really powerful and emotion-laden way, focusing on the emotional and sometimes physical harms experienced by family members of migrants who die or go missing. So for example, here on the right is a social media post that was shared by the US consulate in Nuevo Laredo, Mexico. And this social media post has a video from the campaign alongside a message about how the remains of hundreds of migrants are found each year in the desert and the pain that this causes families. Similarly, on the left is a still image, and this is from a documentary, which are 5 to 6 minute long mini documentaries that are produced, that was produced for the campaign. So in this documentary, we have the young man pictured telling the story of his mom migrating and disappearing. He, alongside his sister and grandmother, proceed to recount the pain the loss has caused them, as well as the physical abuses the children suffered at the hands of the family member who they were left in the care of. In this video, familial pain is centered, and it's used to dissuade migration attempts through a tale of unmet promises and the unintended consequences on one's children. In both of these examples, the grief of those left behind is mobilized to tether potential migrants to their home communities by highlighting the more than individual consequences of unauthorized migration attempts. The focus on the family and mobilization of familial guilt undermines discourses of necessary or respectable parental sacrifice. Instead, the migrant is recast as irresponsible, transforming migration attempts from a valiant effort to sacrifice in order to provide for one's family into an irresponsible pursuit that leaves loved ones worse off than they would be otherwise. Moreover, here we see individual migration decisions framed as the locus and cause of familial harm. And this really obscures the central role that structural inequalities play in compelling migration and creating harm. By centering the potentiality of familial pain and suffering, PICS work to recast and redistribute responsibility for pain experienced by children and family members onto individual migrants and the decisions they make. So those were early campaigns. Then we have in 2014, the family and familial relationships became much more prevalent in US campaigns. And this is really related to demographic shifts and migrants were arriving in the US. Most significantly in 2014, the US saw what was termed a humanitarian crisis with the number of so-called unaccompanied minors arriving at the border really increasing. And we saw a dramatic increase at the same time of PICS really focused on this phenomenon and really focused on targeting children as well as their families. So here on the right, we see a screenshot from a commercial called The Yellow Sweater, in which we see a mother preparing her child for a migration journey. And she's sewing phone numbers into the inside of his yellow sweater. The child tells her he doesn't want to go, but she assures him it will be okay and he will be better off. This is then followed by a dramatic scene in which the child is seemingly chased down by kidnappers and disappeared into the desert. This is still available on the campaign website, so you can go and watch the video if you're interested in seeing the full thing. It's really important to note that this video really implicitly reiterates and sort of recognizes highly publicized incidents of migrant disappearances and massacres that have happened in Mexico. So this commercial, like many others produced as part of the campaign, closes with the announcer speaking directly to parents saying, "A life of regret won't bring your child back." So within this context, we see guilt and regret mobilized as families, mothers in particular, are spoken to and framed as responsible for unauthorized migration attempts and any violence that might result. The possibility of regret and child loss are mobilized to reorient parents away from supporting their children in migrating as a means to access a better life or safety, and towards hindering their mobility in the interest of keeping them safe. The potentiality of regret undermines parental hope that in migration, children can access safety and prosperity. And in doing so, the responsible, caring, and loving parent is imagined as the parent who keeps their child safe by stopping unauthorized migration attempts. So in both contexts, both the US and Australia, even though I did not go into the empirics on the Australia case, PICS aim to produce effective responses that really reorient migrants away from migration and towards their familial responsibilities, and this seemingly binary either or decision, using really a powerful emotion such as guilt, loss, and shame. Effective messages push potential migrants to compare themselves with an imaginary idealized other, the more responsible mother or the good family role model, rather than the risky path they could take as a migrant. We argue that PICS mobilize emotions and affective attachments, not only to produce individual and collective bodies, as Sarah Ahmed has argued, but also to attach those bodies to particular territories. Through these highly emotional images, narratives, and sounds, the PICS work to tether migrants to territory and render them immobile. So quickly, just to summarize, analysis of PICS produced by the US and Australian governments illustrates how the spectrum of the family and familial ideologies work to produce particular emotional and affective attachments that aim to affect migration-related decisions. And working through strategically crafted images, sounds, and narratives, PICS function as a form of affective governmentality, working to shape decisions and actions through the production of particular affective responses. So the PICs that we're talking about here are different than some of the other PICs that were talked about previously and will be talked about that are really focused on the legal consequences. These are really focused on really pulling at the emotions of people. Our analysis of PICs also illustrates that emotions and affective attachments are mobilized to not only create individual and collective bodies, but to attach those bodies to particular territories. So the family is mobilized as a vector of both love and responsibility that brings with it the potentiality of causing harm, grief, and shame. The positive attachments of providing for one's family through migration are countered via images and sounds of breeding used to incite negative attachments. And framing migration-related tragedies and associated experiences of loss, grief, and guilt as resulting from individual and familial decisions, PICs work to reorient potential migrants towards home. Rather than contending with the political, economic, or life and death reasons that push individuals to migrate, PICs work to recast immobility as the responsible decision one makes in order to ensure the safety, security, and respectability of one's family. So I just want to finish with some questions to consider and perhaps to compel conversation in a few minutes. The first is it morally and ethically acceptable to circulate graphic PICs amongst populations experiencing high levels of trauma? I made a very explicit decision not to show you some of the videos included because they're very intense, to say the least. So rather graphic. Some of the Australian PICs try to reproduce the sound of people drowning, for example. I think there are a lot of ethical and moral questions to consider when we think about the trauma already being experienced amongst the populations where these are being circulated. And the second thing is that I think this compels a lot of questions about migrant grievability. So, now for decades, scholars and activists have really been drawing attention to the way in which migrants are often rendered ungrievable, right? So there is not a lot of attention or response to migrant deaths. But in these PICs, we really see migrant deaths and the abuse that migrants experience as centered. But it brings up questions about who is allowed to grieve migrants and when are migrants grievable and by whom and in what context. I will finish there. I am including Kate's email here as well in case anyone has questions on the Australian case. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Jill, for these fascinating insights in this affective governmentality. So now on to Antoine.
Thank you. So thanks a lot for the invitation. I'm very happy to be here and a great pleasure, very interesting to listen to two wonderful presentations. So I don't really have a fully prepared PowerPoint, sort of finalizing right now a paper which I will draw upon for this short presentation. And basically what I'm trying to do is I'm trying to connect two fields of policy which are the object of intense debate and scholarship right now. The first one being precisely information campaigns, and the second one being so-called voluntary returns. These two aspects of current migration policies have been studied a lot, but quite often separately, as if there were two different things taking place. And I'm trying to connect them for different reasons. First, because as we already saw, returnees themselves can become messages. So the returnee can become a message that is vehicled among potential migrants to discourage them from migrating. So we really have to connect the message with the people who are sent back. I mean, the European countries not only send messages, they send people back. And those people are themselves messages, sometimes very explicit. The returnees are showcased in information campaigns. Sometimes it's implicit, the message being, look, all these people are being returned. This means that migration is not worth the try, not worth the effort. So that's the first common point. And perhaps the second common point to the two policies is the role of communication. So I'm going to center really my presentation on this notion of communication and all the ramification it entails, because obviously information campaigns, as was already suggested by Leila at the beginning, is fully about communication. And voluntary returns, to some extent, have a communicative effect as well. But also, and this is quite important, there are quite a few interesting studies being published in recent years over the topic. Before the voluntary return takes place, there's an exchange that takes place between the potential returnees and the policymaker or the street-level bureaucrats or the social worker who are tasked to ensure the voluntariness of the return. And this can be understood as a kind of communication. So basically, this discussion between the state and the migrant, the irregular migrant usually, about whether or not this person, he or she, should voluntarily, quote unquote, return to his or her country. So there's a kind of communication process taking place here. So I think we can really speak about the kind of communicative turn in immigration policy, in which there's a big emphasis put on communication with migrants, towards migrants, and also towards would-be potential migrants before they migrate back in the home country. And the reason why I find this communication aspect interesting is that it tends to contrast with migration control. Usually migration control is largely based on coercion, is based on force. It's based on the state using its legitimate violence and force to block people. We hear a lot, for example, these days about all the pushbacks taking place in Greece. That's typically a pure force-based measure. You take the people and you simply push them far away from Europe. So it's total opposite of communication, just taking the people and pushing them as far away as possible. So communication from that perspective tends to contrast, I would say, with standard patterns of migration control, which are very much a top-down coercitive process. So the first question I want to raise is this relationship between control and communication. I think information campaigns in that respect are quite interesting. Sometimes they actually showcase the control. I can briefly show something you probably all know already about. It's this very well-known Australian information campaigns in which you see a soldier and the army in the back of the picture, and the people being controlled, the migrants being controlled. So here you really have communication about control. The campaign actually showcases control. It showcases the people in charge of control, which is the army in that case, and it shows how people are physically, controlled by the state. So that's one option of this control communication nexus or relationship. But I would say that in other campaigns, they can be quite different. They can actually hide control. You've got lots of campaigns which stress the fact that, for example, migrating is dangerous. So you see shipwrecks in the Mediterranean Sea, for example, or you see people who are encouraged to contribute to development of their home country and this kind of things. But the control itself is not showcased. Even when you show shipwrecks, for example, you show the danger of the sea, but you never make explicit in the campaign that this danger of the sea is the product of migration control. So communication here works to hide or to depoliticize migration control, as if the sea was a kind of naturally dangerous area, whereas obviously the fact that people cross the sea is precisely the outcome of migration control. But this is sort of sidelined, marginalized in the campaign. So perhaps the first point I wanted to raise is this complex relationship between control and communication. You can use communication to reinforce control by showing control and reminding people that control is very much here and that it will block you whatever you want to try to do. That's the Australian strategy I just showed. Or you can use communication to sort of push control out of the picture and do as if irregular migration was a dangerous, unwise behavior, regardless of immigration policy and regardless of state strategies to control migration. So that's the first question I wanted to ask. And perhaps the second point I wanted to make is what does this communication or emphasis on communication tell us about immigration policy? There's a big literature in political theory that basically argues, and this echoes what Verena was exposing in her presentation, that basically echoes the fact that immigration policy is always kind of illiberal. It always sort of targets people who have no counterpower. They have no way of contesting state authority because they're outside the demos, they're outside the people, they're outside the territory. And so the government, when it treats non-citizens, migrants at the border, is always acting in kind of illiberal, undemocratic way, because there's no way you can ensure a kind of smooth democratic process with people outside your territory who come from the outside. So from that perspective, you could argue, it's an hypothesis, that communication is to some extent a kind of normalization. It's a kind of strategy to say, well, let's not treat migrants as simply people who have to be pushed back, for example. Let's treat them as reasonable people with whom we engage a genuine communication, and we expose the arguments, and we hope that we will reach an agreement on the fact that immigration, irregular immigration, is dangerous, for example. So in that case, you have, communication would be a kind of liberal, in the philosophical sense, immigration policy, in which the state exposes its arguments, just like Hannah was discussing, and tells people, look, this is the situation, that's the danger. Are you sure you want to do this? We think it's a bad choice, and we're trying to convince you. So we're not using our force, we're not using pure coercion, we're really engaging in what Habermas would call communicative action. That is to say, we try to share with you our rationality, and we try to convince you of the way we think, and we appeal to your reason. We appeal to your capacity to by yourself realize that risking your life in Libya, at sea, or wherever is not it's not a good thing to do. So you'd better avoid this behavior. So to some extent, the stress in communication is a way of normalizing immigration policy, which is more or less like any policy in which you try to convince people before you coerce them. And the same with voluntary return, by the way, in which rather than simply expulsing people, you tell them, look, we think this is not the right place for you to be. You should return to your country. And we try to convince you that it's the best thing to do. We do not simply expel you using force and brutality. We try to engage in, again, a communicative action process and to convince you that the best thing to do is to return to your country, to the extent the return is called voluntary, in the sense that it's not imposed by the state, but it's chosen, quote unquote, by the returnee himself or herself. But of course, you have a big literature, as Hannah was also suggesting, that stresses the fact that this communication is fundamentally fake communication. It's not a sincere, genuine communication. It amounts to a kind of propaganda, or what Habermas would call publicity. That is to say, a kind of manipulative way of using language, imposing views, imposing arguments upon people who are in a weaker position. So the idea here is that there's no way you can really communicate if communication is backed by force. In the case of information campaign, it's quite clear. You can tell people, you can dissuade them from immigrating, but the message makes no sense, because even if they don't listen to the message, even if they don't listen and migrate anyway, it will be blocked and through by coercive measures anyway. The same with voluntary return. There's no point convincing people to return if in any case they will be returned by force if they don't agree to return voluntarily. So in that case, communication is by definition sort of superficial. It's not genuine. It's simply a way of cosmetically hiding or accompanying the use of force. It's a very frequent argument, a very frequent criticism of information campaigns, and it's often coupled with another criticism, which points to the cynical dimension of these campaigns, because obviously, pointing to the risks of irregular migration, which are the consequence of immigration policy, is pretty cynical, because you actually create the conditions for danger to happen, and then you warn about the danger, which is a kind of cynical way of doing things. So that's perhaps one way of criticizing this communication, is to argue that it's a communication that is taking place in such an imbalanced context, in relationship that is so imbalanced between the state and the would-be migrants on the other hand, that this communication simply cannot happen. Because to put it simply, the target of the communication, the would-be migrants or the returnees, they have no way they can afford to disagree, because if they disagree, they will be forced to obey anyway. So that's the contrary of communication. You cannot try to persuade people if in any case you would use the force if they disagree with you. On the other hand, I think if you read some of the ethnographic qualitative studies on voluntary returns and information campaigns, you can see that to some extent there's always some kind of communicative action, again, to use Habermas' framework, behind the use of communication. I mean, the idea here, and I know it's a tricky idea to develop because it sort of runs against much of the literature on information campaigns. The idea being that when you use language, when you try to develop an argument, when you appeal to people's reason, as information campaigns try to do, you always kind of, perhaps the word justification is too strong, but nevertheless you strive towards a kind of justification. Here in the background you have huge philosophical debates on the philosophy of language, by precisely people like the Frankfurter School, Habermas, and others. And the idea being that the very reliance on language, it entails a kind of reliance on reason, and therefore opens up a kind of public sphere. So the idea being here that even though you might cynically put forward a message that simply accompanies the use of force in migration control, by putting this into words, you actually open up a discussion, you open up a debate, which you don't do if you simply force people to behave in a certain manner. There's no way you can discuss that because it's pure force. If you put this force into words, then at the level of language, at least, the discussion can take place. So here, the key point is precisely, the extent to which communication and language can be completely disconnected from a kind of a reason-based discussion. There are a few studies, for example, that show, so far I found some of the studies that show that, for example, information campaigns are a way of justifying immigration policy in the eyes of the public opinion of receiving countries. So you do have studies that show, for example, that if you expulse people brutally, some people in the destination country in Europe will disagree. They will say, no, that's too brutal. I'm not happy with that. But if you transform this brutal return into a voluntary return and you accompany it with some support for development and so on, then some people say, oh, okay, why not? I understand the point and I support this policy. And sometimes they actually contribute. You have a nice study on Germany that 15 years ago that shows that some key actors like churches, for example, they were against the expulsions of refugees. But when the expulsions was turned into a voluntary return, they actually accompanied the returnees to their home country, helping them, providing all kinds of social support to returnees. So to some extent, the language, the communication is important. It can have a performative effect. It can change the way people perceive the policy, and it can change the support you enjoy for your policy. So that's little documented, but what is so far very underdocumented is the impact of information campaigns on the migrants, on the pre-migrants, on the would-be migrants themselves. I found a few studies. I still think there's a lot of research to be done here, but the question being, how do they perceive that? I mean, there are a few studies that show basically that they don't buy it. They simply say, that's simply nonsense. This is simply propaganda by the EU. They don't want me, and they simply send those messages. I just don't believe that. But there are a few studies that show that you do have some kind of a debate that emerges on the basis of these information campaigns, because these information campaigns actually, justify or explain why migration should not take place or why people should renounce to their migration project. And on that basis, people can say, well, no, I agree, I disagree. And some people in the home country, in the sending country, will to some extent be sensitive to the argument, others will not. And this will precisely open up a kind of public sphere in which you can discuss what is a legitimate immigration project, for example. So these examples, even if there's scarce evidence about that, but I'm trying to figure this out. These examples show that to some extent, when you frame or when you communicate about something, you open up the possibility of a genuine debate, which is typically an Habermas-inspired argument about communicative action in the public sphere. Of course, this is not to say that there would be a kind of genuine debate between Europe and potential migrants in the global south about what is good migration and so on. This is simply unrealistic. The debate takes place in a very much a very strong power imbalances. On the other hand, that's perhaps the tricky sort of ambivalent aspect of language and communication. You can use language and communication to push your point and to tell people what to do. But by using language and communication, you also put forward your arguments and you expose your arguments to open criticisms. So there's a difference to some extent between simply pushing people back. That's a pure use of force, and pushing people back because you argue that it's not good, they should stay at home for development, they should not take the risk of migrating, and so on. When you start exposing your arguments, the arguments can be contested, and you enter in a kind of justification process. So that would be the main hypothesis I'm trying to discuss in this paper, the fact that to some extent, by communicating about migration, the risk of migration, irregular migration, and so on, states to some extent pursue simply a control-oriented objective. They want to complement control by a kind of propaganda. That's a typical use of political language to tell people what to think. That's there's a big literature on criticism of propaganda and political speech and so on, obviously. But the tricky thing about language is that they also engage in a kind of discursive exchange in which they tell people, well, we think you should not migrate, or we think you should return because, and they list certain arguments, and these arguments can be discussed. Of course, doesn't mean the discussion will yield a kind of consensus or compromise in a kind of typical public sphere dynamic, not at all. But nevertheless, it kind of opens up a kind of asymmetric, kind of post-colonial, imbalanced public sphere, which is nevertheless a kind of public sphere. So interestingly, and what I'm trying to do is to connect this with global migration governance. I'm also working on the debates that take place between states in global migration fora, like the Global Forum for Migration Development or the UN, or meetings organized by the UN. And here you can see more or less the same process. Basically, states from the global north and the global south discuss and try to agree on what would be, good migration, what would be acceptable migration for all parties. But obviously, these forums, they're completely unable to listen to all the voices. And even though formally you have civil society, you have representatives of migrants and so on, these are marginal voices, and these forums are unable to fully, reach to really set up the conditions for a genuine discussion on the topic. On the other hand, you can see the same process at stake, which is basically a reaction to the illiberal nature of immigration policy, and therefore you can see information campaigns as a kind of global migration governance from below, at the level of people, not at the level of states in UN meetings, for example. Right, I think I have exhausted my time, so thanks a lot for your attention, and sorry if I was a few minutes late. Thanks.
No worries at all, Antoine. You weren't late, but we collectively were late. So, but in order to give some space for the discussion, because I think you put up, all the three of you put up so important reflections. So I really wanted to engage in a discussion with our audience. So in case you have already posted questions, I think Julia, our manager, MPC manager, will forward them to me. There are no questions so far, I see, so I give you the opportunity to formulate some. And in the meantime, I also have some questions, because these thoughts were really like, they turned the telescope, so to say. So I wanted to ask you, I thought about a lot about what you said, Jill, about this affective governmentality, right? And I think that's a very nice turn to describe what is going on. But on the other hand, I also wondered, when was politics ever non-affective, right? Especially when it's about like values, political ideologies, there is always moral at stake. So I wondered, what is new now? Is it more that it's not the conviction anymore, but a discursive strategy? And why do we see that moral comes into play exactly now in the migration field? Why not before? So these were questions that were really triggered by your debate. Another question I had when Antoine also was speaking, when you spoke about how Australia embodies this control aspect in their campaigns, and maybe here also Verena and Jill can speak to the differences between the regions, right? And then the EU has very much this focus on the grief and the loss. So can it be that Australia has much more a self-image on being tough on control, whereas Europe at least claims to have these human values that it wants to also hold up, right? So I think that's why also we might see this, but I don't know. I want to hear more about this. And another aspect is, So, I mean, then you relativated it, Antoine, in the end, and I think that's a very novel and good perspective. But I just wanted to add, you say, if you disagree, you will be forced anyway. And then you said it, but I just wanted to emphasize, I think governments rely on the compliance or on the cooperation by migrants exactly because you can't return many migrants, right? So it's not only, oh, now we're entering into this debate because we want to be open, or it's also not because anyway we can force you, because they can't. That's exactly the point, right? Because of several factors. So I think there is also this need. So I wanted to hear more about this, how much they also rely, and why now do they realize they rely so much on this, or maybe they always figured this. And another question, because also to all of you, like this moralistic turn, or however you can call it, right? That I think, I don't know exactly how you observed it, but which really appeared with the smuggling debate, right? Do voters buy this in the sense? Of course, I mean, here you also have some kind of polarization, but to the big chunk of voters who are concerned about humans, and we know they are not radical anti-immigrant or whatever, but who can be also concerned about these humans, do they buy these moralizing arguments and forget about these other factors that play, that make these routes dangerous? So yeah, I wanted to, and also maybe before you answer my question, I also will raise some others from the audience. So our former colleague, Eugenio Cosomano, so greetings on this way to you, Eugenio, says, I'd like to hear more on how these information campaigns are justified. Do they deploy a humanitarian logic, stressing that communicating risks aggressively saves lives? So I think you partly already addressed this also very nicely in the comparison, but if you could summarize these aspects again, maybe to all the three of you. If there are no questions, yeah, sorry, I'm just asking Julia, if there is no questions by now, I would ask our presenters to answer this set of questions, and then we look again if there is more questions, but feel free to ask. Yeah.
I can start because I think my response sort of responds to the question in the chat, as well as some of the questions that you raised, which has to do with this sort of why did these emerge when they did. And so I'll share a little bit about the US context, and I'm curious to hear about people whose work is in other places in the world. So the way that I first became aware of public information campaigns was because I was doing research on the criminalization of humanitarianism. And I started hearing from former Border Patrol agents about how in the early 1990s, there were all of these, what they referred to as grassroots campaigns, where they would create paper flyers and put them in migrant shelters in Mexico to warn migrants of the risks, because they were seeing more people in distress and they felt, you know, like this was a serious issue. Those campaigns then became institutionalized and expanded across the agency around 2003, 2004. In the US context, there's two important things to note here. One is that we had a massive increase in border enforcement related to post 9/11, the reorganization of the Department of Homeland Security and border enforcement coming under that. So there were just more resources. But also in 2003, there was a very, very highly publicized migrant tragedy in which a number of migrants died in the back of a tractor trailer. They suffocated to death. Some of the individuals within the Border Patrol who became central to creating the first campaigns were individuals that responded to that tragedy. So not only was the state put in the position of responding to migrant deaths because they were becoming more sort of publicly aware, or more publicly visible, but also you had individuals within the agency that were very personally affected and felt like they needed to do something to stop deaths. So there's both this sort of state-centric sort of goal of sort of making people, sort of making it seem like they're doing something to prevent migrant deaths, as well as what I would argue are very sort of honest commitments to reducing pain and suffering among migrants, amongst individual agents. So there's this really interesting sort of combination of humanitarianism and control playing out in the US case study.
maybe Verena and Antoine, do you want to address? And then we have 2 more questions.
Yeah, I have. So the question of one second. Yeah, here we go. The question of opening up political accountability, why there are these differences between the EU and the US, and so on, what the emotionality has to do with it. This is something that struck me when I looked at these 2 campaigns, that they're so different. And for these 2 campaigns, I can say that that this is definitely a response to the experiences during the migration crisis starting in 2014. Both of these campaigns, and there's also that we know of for other campaigns in Europe, they have mushroomed basically after 2015 and 16. So there are some kind of like a initiative, in my view, symbolic initiative to do something against the loss of life, and as a dissuade. It was like soft tools for migration control. So in that sense, I thought it was very interesting to hear Jill's research on this increasingly emotional focus, this emotionality of it. We have it in the Where Migrants campaign. There's a focus on smuggling as well, of course. The boat issue is a big problem there. There's what's being emotionalized, but not to that extent. So that's actually something that I'm trying to figure out, if we can use these campaigns not as much as not in terms of the question of what they do to migrants or if they do anything. So going beyond effectiveness, but looking at them, what do they tell us about the organizations behind these campaigns and about their assumptions and policies, their policy understandings that they have of irregular migration. I don't know if that answers all the questions, but yes, Antoine, if you want to go ahead.
Yes, thanks for the question. Well, I would not have the empirical evidence to really establish a kind of comparison between campaigns in different countries. I would simply say that, I think there's a continuum, right? I was very interested in what you said, Leila, about the fact that you can use communication because you don't have control, which is indeed perhaps a third possible option. So perhaps we can think of this as 3 possible options. You can actually use communication to showcase control, because control happens and you want to make sure that people know that control happens. This can target both migrants and your own citizens. You want to show that you're doing something. You can use communication to actually do as if you were not controlling, do as if you were, because to some extent you don't want to put forward the control. You want to simply to depoliticize it to some extent, sometimes also for electoral reasons. And as you say, perhaps you can use communication because you think you will not be able to control, and therefore you do as if you would be able to control, but actually you hope that people will follow the communication because they cannot be controlled otherwise. And about the humanitarian argument, because there was a question that was asked about the humanitarian argument, I think now typically this humanitarian argument, I should have mentioned it, because it typically indeed is the outcome, I would say, of a process through which people try to find a common language, because there's a lot to say about humanitarian, as saving lives is a kind of absolute moral imperative no one can disagree with. There's a big literature on this, obviously, but it's quite clear that the emphasis on humanitarian, humanitarian need to save lives and to prevent risks like smuggling or trafficking or rapes or whatever. This is typically an argument that is designed to be agreeable to all. So it is actually the outcome, I would say, of a deliberative or public sphere process in which you try to find out what argument appeals to everybody. Because if you simply based on the interest of the receiving country, then you can simply say, we don't want migrants, we want to control, that's it. But if you want to make an argument that's appealing to all, then somehow you have to rephrase control in a different way, and the humanitarian arguments become absolutely central. I can see there are a few other questions, so I'm not sure. I'll stop here now, and perhaps we can start answering the other questions that have been appearing.
There was one question from our colleague Federica Infantino, who also is interested. I find your approach very novel also, Verena, as you underlined. You look at actually what is the thinking behind and what are the institutional structures that shape these campaigns. But I think it's still also important to address questions that Federica and also Joe Lowry had is about the effects of the communication campaigns on those who are targeted, right? And also Joe particularly asks about effects on less skilled irregular migrants in host destination, but also transit countries, because indeed transit countries also play much and more important role. So if you have any insights on those aspects. Maybe to start with Jill and then Marina and Antoine.
So I have not done any research with migrants on the effect, but there is some, Lauren Heidbrink has a really great book that has a chapter on migrant youth's perceptions of public information campaigns, specifically in the highlands of Guatemala, which shows that they're not effective, right? I mean, and that's, I mean, I think one of the ironies of this topic is that there actually is very little evidence that they actually are effective, and yet millions of dollars are being spent and billions of whatever currency, right, of the particular government are being spent to sort of produce these campaigns. So one of the things that's interesting is the public relations firms that are often contracted to produce the campaigns produce evaluation reports, but they're largely measuring sort of the reach of campaigns. So how many people can remember them? So there's actually very little research out there on how people are sort of taking them up.
Can I just add one question to the original one, so we don't go much over time, because I think also Cecilia Scanetti had a important question, because she asks, what about that these campaigns are often then contested in the local community, right? So, because I think it's also, if I understand the question right, it's also dynamic, also what stays is the initial message of the campaign implementer, nevertheless, even though it's contested. So how can we interpret this? Sorry to add, but just to have it in line with the other questions maybe also addressed, because Jill already addressed now a little bit the impact, but if you have also more insights, but also to this question about local contestation of these campaigns and the potential impact or no impact whatsoever.
Should I go ahead, Laila? Yeah. I second Jill, and I have, so basically my approach to these campaigns was starting to learn about or trying to figure out what effect they have. So this is not part of my research, but this is kind of like this, the tipping point that made me do this research afterwards, because there is really, and this is what I meant in the beginning with the criticism, that one of the big criticism is that we simply do not know that they work. First of all, there's still people still choose irregular pathways because they simply do not have access to regular pathways in many cases. The other aspect is that these campaigns also, what I said also before, is that they put the one way of steering this, maybe also to kind of answer to Federica's question at the same time, that one of the ways of what they try to do is to discipline indirectly. And this also goes back to what Antoine said, in a way shifting responsibility to migrants themselves, providing information. Now you have the information, is it really still such a good idea to migrate, given all the risks? Disciplining the movement of people. Otherwise, I have not done research on the actual effects. I know that the intentions behind these campaigns are not, as far as the campaigns that I've looked at go, they're not necessarily ill-intentioned, but they are, in a way, they cannot be effective because they can't really change behavior, especially when they're done by social media. They can reach people, but it's very unclear whether they can actually change behaviors. On the other hand, they also, when governments are involved and when they're obviously involved, that is from the study that I referenced before, commissioned by the European Commission. So what this organization has done is to ask people about how they react to migration, to governmental information. The trust decreases So the more visible the government is, the less people actually trust the information provided, which creates a transparency problem. So the question really is, what can these information campaigns do with the involvement of governments? And way more research needs to be done when it comes to this.
Thanks, Verena. I just, since we are already over time, but I still want to take these last two questions, so I ask them now. And maybe, Antoine, you can give us also a roundup then on those. So I think Nesrin Ben Brahim asked a very important question when you think about migration cooperation with third countries. She says, I'm curious about the campaigns launched pre-arrival. I assume they require some validation from countries of origin and transit. How do these campaigns feed or interact with these countries' policies? So I think that's really an interesting question also. And also Kirsten von Greve, she said also, if I understand her question right, so it's about like really ideal categorization of who a migrant is, but then what about mixed migration, right? How are they addressed or in the field of campaigns? So yeah, I think I hope I didn't forget any. Now it's a big mix, but I also wanted to say I leave it at these questions. I hand over the word again to you, but if you have any more questions, of course, we are happy to engage more. Contact the speakers directly, contact us at MPC. But now the word over also for last round, starting with Antoine, and then maybe going round for very brief final words also by Jill and Verena. Yes.
Thanks. Yes, so very quickly, I don't have much information about the impact of the information campaigns. Of course, there are a few studies, as Jill was saying, that shows that it does not have a big effect, and we can wonder in terms of evidence-based policy making why we still put all this money for policies that are not really successful. But I would say that we should go beyond this sort of policy-oriented discussion, and because I think there are two different things. People can be indifferent to the campaign, that is, they do as if it didn't exist, or they can contest the argument. I think these are two very different things. I mean, from a policy perspective, it means that people will not comply, whether they're indifferent or they contest, does not really matter. At the end of the day, they will not comply. But from a kind of public sphere perspective, it's not at all the same thing. Whether you engage in the argument and you start discussing or contesting, or whether you're indifferent, is two very different things. And I would say that indeed you have contestation, and contestation is a way of engaging in debate. Even though people don't agree, they still engage in the debate. In terms of the impact, I think also we have to go perhaps look at the long-term perspective. I have a friend of mine who's not working in the migration studies, but working on the cultural industry in French-speaking West Africa. And he shows that, French-speaking artists in lots of those French-speaking countries used to be very much open borders type of people, and now they're all engaged into sort of risk adverse information campaigns. So over like a period of time of like 20 years, the cultural industry has changed a lot with musicians, singers, pop stars, and this type of people very popular with the youth. Does not mean again that they managed to convince the youth, but no, this is still an important aspect. On the long run, you can actually, at least you can silence some people that used to be very much against your policy. They used to be, sing open borders song, for example, and now they sing songs about the risk of irregular migration. It's a minor change from a global perspective, but locally it can make a big difference. In terms of perhaps the sending country, indeed that's a key point. And again, I think that's perhaps from a more standard sort of international relation perspective. This is really why organizations like IOM come in, because they appear as sort of honest brokers, as IOs are often called. So they don't appear as serving exclusively the interest of the receiving country. They're supposed, at least that's their mandate, to take into account the interest of all countries and migrants themselves. And that's why, indeed, to some extent, they can sweeten the pill, and they can make it easier for sending countries to cooperate in the implementation of these campaigns. That's why also it's so important to find a common language, like humanitarian arguments we just discussed, because once you have this common language, no one can really disagree with the setting up of the information campaign. As far as mixed migration is concerned, as far as I know, campaigns hardly care about mixed migration. They tend to discourage mobility whatsoever, whether it's for refugee protection or whether it's for economic migration. I mean, they're really sort of anti-mobility campaigns, sort of sedentariness campaigns, encouraging people to stay in their country. I have not really seen the campaigns, perhaps I've missed something, but I have not really seen campaigns that would actually distinguish between the two. And as a matter of fact, that's a frequent criticism, because information campaigns are accused of discouraging people from seeking protection or refugee status abroad. In terms of disciplining, yes, of course. I think that if you go all the way back to standard work by Foucault and governmentality and so on, he shows really how modern states have relied on disciplining techniques. We can probably argue that migration policy so far has not really relied on this type of techniques. It's more, as I was trying to suggest, based on force and coercion in a kind of pre-modern way, at least from a kind of Foucault perspective. But obviously, perhaps this communicative term is a way of connecting with sort of modern way of exercising power, which is about disciplining and convincing people rather than simply telling and forcing them to do something. But obviously, that's a huge debate, so I don't think the few minutes we have left will enable us to discuss this in full length. Thanks.
Thanks so much, Antoine. A last word to Jill and Verena very briefly to round up.
I just, in closing, want to touch on this issue of sort of the involvement of sending countries or countries of transit. Based on my research, there's evidence both that there is what Antoine is talking about, where this idea that nobody can not agree with these efforts to save lives or prevent deaths, right? So that was used in the early 2000s by the US Border Patrol agents who were trying to get Mexican government officials and also Mexican NGOs on board with helping with the distribution of campaigns. But the other thing that I want to mention, which I find this incredibly fascinating, is that we also see evidence that there are more sort of coercive efforts at play as well. So in particular, around 2015, there was a provision added to the US regulations on international aid that required countries of the Northern Triangle, so Guatemala, El Salvador, and Honduras, to warn their citizens of the dangers of irregular migration as a contingency for receiving international aid. So a certain portion of the aid they receive from the United States is contingent upon them demonstrating that they are doing this. We simultaneously see greater involvement by governmental agencies in Central American and government officials in promoting and distributing these campaign materials and messages, right? So there's both this sort of more just people participating because they believe in saving lives, but we also have this coercive nature of manipulating international aid and sort of economic drivers that are pushing that forth. Thank you all so much.
Thanks so much, Jill. Verena, the last word is on you.
Thank you. I have maybe one last comment to the question on mixed migration and how to distinguish. My impression is also that this is very general, and that this is also that the communication to migrants is very general. And I think this also has to be, because how would you set up one campaign that directs different groups with different kinds of legal sets? So this is a problem. One, I'm aware of, or I know that several governments, and I do not mean, as far as I'm aware, this is not the case for the two campaigns that I looked at, but there are several campaigns that have started to use social media advertisements, so Facebook advertisement. There's social media managers who start, that are engaged by the government and who actually start paying for Facebook ads. And you can check them out in the Facebook ad library. You need to know in which countries the campaigns have been placed. You need to know which institution, which Facebook account it has done it, and then you can find current active Facebook ads. And that is another, I'm repeating myself, but this is another problem in terms of government communication. Do we really want governments to start paying for Facebook ads, telling migrants about the restrictions in the country? So that sounds quite polemic right now, but there is definitely kind of like a blurring of lines between government communication as an executive organ and then for these more migration related issues.
Thanks so much to all of you, and most of all, thanks also so much to our audience who were listening and engaging. For me, it was a real honor to share this, and I'm sure we continue the discussion. And I would want to maybe also add or give to all of us that we really think about these shifts that you all highlighted, or as Antoine framed it, maybe a shift from disciplinary, from control to disciplinary. Maybe then also there is a communication or conversation to be had to scholars who work on migrant integration policies, where we have this disciplinary term. So what are differences? What are similarities? You can already see this open up very much food for thought and interlinkages with other policy fields. So thanks so much again to our three excellent speakers and to the dear audience, and have a lovely rest of your afternoon. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye. Thank you very much.